There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges.
Who taught you to hate the texture of your hair? Who taught you to hate the color of your skin to such extent that you bleach to get like the white man?
This is the first of a video series on protests in America. Today, boycott, breakfast, and guns protesting for civil rights and black power in the 1960s and 70s. The 1950s to 1960s civil rights movement was likely catalyzed in 1954 by the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court case, which ruled segregation in public schools unconstitutional. A year later, Emmett Till's violent murder set the context for the Montgomery bus boycott, which started after Rosa Parks' widely known refusal to give up her seat for a white passenger. Parks was the secretary of the Montgomery NAACP and a well-known community activist. The Montgomery bus boycott succeeded after 13 months, and Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as a leader in the civil rights movement. He cemented his leadership in his first speech as president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, just 4 days after Rosa Parks was arrested. This would become known as the Holt Street Address. Martin Luther King believed in a philosophy of nonviolence, the most effective means of protest, but this does not mean complacency. He said in 1957, quote, "The nonviolent resistor is just as opposed to the evil that he is standing against as the violent resistor, but he resists without violence. This method is non-aggressive physically, but strongly aggressive spiritually." King continued to fight against inequality into the 1960s, leading large-scale protests and prompting landmark civil rights legislation. I'll summarize the major events for brevity's sake because this is a subject often taught in school. In April 1963, King was arrested and wrote the letter from Birmingham jail. Then in August of that year, he led the March on Washington with over 200,000 people in attendance. Then, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed the next year in July, and in 1965, the Selma March for Black voting rights happened. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee Chairman and future Congressman John Lewis, who led the Selma March, said, "They came toward us, beating us with nightsticks, trampling us with horses, and releasing their tear gas. I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick." Still, King remained committed to nonviolence. Throughout the 1960s, King's ideologies evolved from calling for only an end to segregation to fighting for total systemic equality. In his 1968 book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, King called for, quote, "a radical restructuring of the architecture of American society." Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on April 4, 1968, but he was only one of many leaders and represented only one faction of a multifaceted and long-lasting fight for civil rights. One leader also celebrated throughout the United States is Malcolm X, a preacher for the Nation of Islam for much of his career and the leader at the forefront of the Black Power movement of the 1960s. The Black Power and Black nationalist movements originated in the 1800s in the form of slave revolts and attempts to create a sovereign nation-state and national Black culture. This evolved in the 1960s to develop educational, religious, cultural, and revolutionary activism. These are too in-depth to delve into completely within the context of this video, but it's important to recognize the disparate beliefs within the broader context of the movement. As an example, some turned to Islam or traditional African religions, rejecting the religion of the slaveholder. Others, such as the National Committee of Black Churchmen, sought to radicalize the Christian faith, on the other hand. The Black Panther Party was part of the Black Power movement and was founded in response to police brutality. They believed that white accommodating peaceful protests were not effective enough to meet the Black community's needs. Transitioning from nationalism to revolutionary nationalism to socialism and internationalism over time, they rejected the idea that simply the embrace of African culture would bring freedom. They thought that some form of active resistance had to be taken. They are known for militant, armed protest, as Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, said, "Black people should and must fight back. Nothing more quickly repels someone bent on destroying you than the unequivocal message, 'Okay, fool, make your move,' and run the same risk I run of dying." Taking advantage of open carry laws in California, one of the first Black Panther actions was effectively to police the police, following police cars and preventing violence at stops by standing at a distance with guns drawn. Later, protesting California gun control legislation, the Panthers marched in the Sacramento State Capitol on May 3, 1967, with loaded rifles and shotguns in tow. The Mulford Act was passed later that year, preventing open carry in California. Panthers held weapons training classes, posted guerrilla warfare propaganda, and had, according to Charles Jones and Judson Jeffries, quote, highly publicized armed confrontations between Panthers and police officers throughout the nation. The Black Panthers were involved in more than just armed protest, though. Chapter community programs served Black communities across the country, including police alert patrols, the Black Panther Intracommunal News Service, Breakfast for Children, medical clinics, community schools, free busing to prisons, free food programs, free clothing and shoes programs, sickle cell anemia testing, and a pest control program. Black Panther co-founder Bobby Seale said of these services, "A lot of people misunderstand the politics of these programs. They're not reform programs. They're actually revolutionary community programs." In President Ronald Reagan's proclamation to make Martin Luther King Day a national holiday, he said, "We honor an American who recognized the great injustice of segregation and discrimination, and made it his life's purpose and toil to right those wrongs in favor of justice, freedom, equality, fairness, and reconciliation." The Black Panthers, on the other hand, are seldom remembered in the same light. I personally only learned about their community programs before college through independent research. Even King was not liked in his time. Many saw him as either too radical or not radical enough. Reagan, a president who wanted to roll back government enforcement of civil rights legislation, enacted policies that actually seem at odds with Martin Luther King's fight for justice. In context, Reagan's celebration of King's legacy might allow him to say that systemic racism was over. King's fight was valiant, and we honor his contributions that helped solve the problems. Yet King was still fighting for radical change when he was assassinated. And Black Panther Party leaders like Fred Hampton were murdered by police, while the party overall was the subject of substantial FBI counterintelligence. So ask yourself, how and why might your previous understanding of the civil rights and Black Power movements be different from the content of this video? What defines a movement as revolutionary? How did different methods of protest affect the movements that embraced them? Thank you. I'll see you next week.